this very brief conversation and presentation, climate change, COVID, and cohesion, which I see, at least in our experience as goal in Zimbabwe, we really see as a triple threat to ending poverty, or at least making a dent in poverty in Zimbabwe. Next slide. Great. I'm sure most of you in the room are familiar with GOAL. GOAL is an Irish international NGO. Those of us in Zimbabwe actually feel really honored to be able to speak to this panel this morning, knowing that it's probably a room mostly filled with Irish people, for which we're extremely grateful that this international NGO has reached parts of the world like Zimbabwe with some fantastic work. You may or may not know, GOAL has been operational since the late 70s. Its mission really focused on helping the most vulnerable people in the world to survive crisis. And we do that through humanitarian work and development work as well. So let's take a little bit of a look at Zimbabwe, and this being just a little bit of background as we go into this discussion around how we got here, sort of where we are, how we got here, and then thinking through the COVID pandemic and opportunities. The GOAL Zimbabwe operation has a staff of about 150, which in terms of size of international NGOs makes us about a mid-size NGO in the Zimbabwean landscape, alongside organizations like World Vision and CARE and Plan International. Operations in Zimbabwe began early 2000s. As I've already touched on briefly, our programs focus on both humanitarian work, which is sort of your emergency, immediate, after an acute emergency or an acute crisis kind of work. And we also do some development programming, mostly funded through Irish Aid. The sectors that we focus on are food security and livelihoods. We look at health, nutrition. We also look at water, sanitation, and hygiene, which, as you can imagine, have become extremely important during this COVID pandemic, targeting both rural and urban. Just some really interesting facts. Over the last, I would say, maybe 20 years of development work in Zimbabwe, it's been quite clear that the vulnerability that most NGOs look at is around the rural landscape. But over the last 2 years, it's become quite clear, and statistics are now, assessments have now been done to give data and numbers behind this phenomenon of a growing urban food insecurity. And as of last major sort of national assessment, about 38% of Zimbabweans were considered food insecure, and these are urban dwelling Zimbabweans, which is a really high figure. We have 11 active grants. We're a pretty active office, and our donors range from, as I've already mentioned, Irish Aid, as well as the UN agencies, the AFDB, the EU, as well as foundations like the Garden Trust. Next slide. Okay. So when we really try to take a look at how we got where we are, or the systems that are in place to get us where we are, first of all, we have the rural system, so to speak, which is largely agrarian. And unfortunately, climate change comes in. We have recurring droughts. I think Zimbabwe is in its 5th year of drought, which actually came on the heels of an El Nino. Prior to that, other sort of long periods of drought. So maybe every 2-3 years are followed by 4 to 5 years of drought. So absolutely destructive in terms of the agrarian economy that we look at when we look at the rural system of livelihood. When we look at the urban system, we are looking at high unemployment, but also a huge percentage or proportion of informal employment. So when the COVID pandemic came upon us, for Zimbabweans, the lockdowns had really adverse impact on lively communities, because when you say 80% of people are informally employed, it means they need to be out on the streets in order to make their livelihoods. They need to be out on the streets selling, buying and selling, in order for them to eat on any given day. Another system I think that really sort of maps how we got where we are is the system of migration. Zimbabwe is no stranger to migration. There's rural, urban, urban, rural migration. There's also regional migration. These systems, sort of the migration patterns, really hugely impacted by lockdown restrictions and the closing of borders, so that communities that once could sort of go up and down between Zimbabwe and, say, South Africa or Botswana or Mozambique for their shopping, to access, less pricey goods, or to trade in their various produce and wares, that hasn't existed for the last 6 months. So it's both rural and urban populations affected by the migration system that has been adversely impacted by lockdowns and restrictions. And then lastly, I think an important system in the Zimbabwean context is social norms, right? We're talking about cohesion, the inequalities between men and women, whether we're looking at the rural landscape, the urban landscape, or the lens is migration itself. We see traditional social norms where women cannot hold certain kinds of wealth, women cannot own cattle, they can only own smaller livestock. Women cannot, because of protection issues, cannot be involved in certain kinds of economic activity like mining, which is a pretty big thing in Zimbabwe now, informal mining, in the informal mining sector. So I think these 4 systems really allow us to really look at how we got where we are. Next slide. So when we look at what GOAL is doing in Zimbabwe, and I'll go through these next few slides very quickly because they're really just about the pictures. Here's a picture of a community that we've reached with small livestock, with a huge emphasis on men becoming involved in small livestock, because the system of social norms says women do small livestock, men do large livestock, and already there's an economic imbalance there. Next slide. So we've been able to see some successes regardless of the lockdowns, regardless of the restrictions brought about by COVID, by the closing of borders. For example, really quick one here, our smallholder livestock farmers and improving breeds. We found that we need to focus on programming that can operate in a sense just within the community without needing that sort of up and down or connections to the cities, connections to the private sector. While they are important, in the lockdown, we found that communities were cut off from those systems, and it's very important for programming to focus around what the community itself can build up from where they are. So I'll just skip to the bottom points. More resources for the same impact, reduced monitoring of activities. These are some of the impacts that we've seen in the COVID pandemic. And then, as I've said, this recognition that community structures should really have been empowered or capacitated even more than we have done.